this training video, I'll be going over the changes in IMO that will go live in the next gen upgrade scheduled for October 10th. So I'm going to access this IMO link from my SOAP tab. And the first thing you'll notice is the change in layout. So the way we should be thinking about IMO going forward is this left-hand panel will be considered your source. This is where you'll find your ICD code for either an assessment problem or to add to both. So I'll go over these different tabs here in the Add From panel, and then we'll go through a few examples of adding any of those codes either to the assessment problems or both, or even how to add an assessment that's selected to your favorites. So while I have assessment selected, meaning whatever I select will be added to today's assessment, I'll start by going over the panels on my left-hand panel. So the first one is the ProblemIT tab, and this will bring up your normal ICD search window. This is where I can text in a description or an assessment and then select from my presented list as we currently do. Where you see the arrow widget, you can select that and it will prompt you for additional details until you arrive at a specific assessment code. So for the sake of this training, I will add chest pain to the assessment from this ProblemIT tab. And you'll see by single clicking on that plus sign, that assessment has been added. The next tab you'll have is the Problems tab. And what this presents is the patient's problems list. When opening this tab, you may see something a little different depending on the patient. So with this patient, it defaults, this orange tells me it's defaulting to the patient's HCC list. And this is bringing up any problems that are HCC coded that haven't been addressed yet in this calendar year. If the patient didn't have any outstanding HCC problems for this calendar year, this page would default to the entire problem list. So just knowing that if you default here, it means there's a problem that needs to be addressed this calendar year. To address a problem, you would simply click on that problem, and it may ask for additional details to pull up a specific code. So I'm just selecting something here. And once I select that final code, that problem would also carry over to my assessments for today. You'll notice now when I came back to this Problems tab, that HCC list is no longer bolded and it opened directly into my problem list. So just by moving that over to assessment, I satisfied this requirement and my last address date has been updated. So that's using your problem list to bring over an assessment. The next tab you'll have is this History tab, and this will pull up a patient's assessment history. So this list is showing you the date, the encounter date that this assessment listed in the description field was addressed. I can use my History tab to pull a historical assessment into this current encounter just by simply clicking on the assessment. You'll notice that pulmonary moved over. So the next tab is my favorites, and this is my personal IMO favorites. These will travel through all patients, and this will be a list of whatever I've designated as a favorite ICD code. So simply by clicking on a code, I can move it over to my assessments. So now I've built my list of assessments for this encounter. I'm going to use sort order, And this will allow me to change the order of the assessments in IMO. And this would also carry forward to my assessment and plan details and any other documentation for this encounter. So if I wanted this anxiety assessment to appear at the top for this encounter, just by clicking on that assessment first, it's now in my new sort order as the first assessment. So I can continue, and I've changed my sort order. I can undo if I didn't want to keep those changes, or even just undo the very last one. But I'll just save and close here. So now I'll move on to the Problems tab. It works exactly the same. This is my current problem list. If I wanted to add to this problem list, I could either search for a new problem. This list should mirror the Problem tab on the right-hand side. Is just listing my current problems. In the History tab, I can pull over any historical assessment into today's problem list. The same applies with the favorites. I can move a favorite into my problem list. The final option is both. So at any point, I can again find a problem, and for this training, I'll just add a new one. And while selecting both, that new assessment has moved over to today's assessment as well as the patient's active problem list. So while both is selected, I can find a new problem. I can access my history to pull in a new assessment and problem, or I can pull it over from my favorites. This favorites icon, if ever I do have and that's just a prompt telling me if I want to modify, I'd have to go to a different tab. But if ever I do want to identify an assessment in my right-hand panel as a favorite, I can simply click this star, and I may have to pop out and go back in. Ideally, identifying this with the favorites star would pull that assessment into my favorites tab. This training environment is not the most reliable with that feature, but it is working. So I'm going to go back to my assessment tab, and we'll review the options you'll have to modify an assessment. I will go into anxiety. And what pulls up on the left-hand side is a modification page. So you'll see at the very upper left corner, it'll tell me that I've right now opened my anxiety assessment. It's going to default to today's date because this assessment will be added to today's encounter. I can select aside if appropriate. Resolving would actually remove this assessment from today's encounters. So you should think of it as sort of as deleting the assessment. I can add a site if appropriate. Status, this is where I would update the assessment status, and access if it were appropriate. This next section here actually pulls in from your assessment and plan documentation page. You can include impression notes, your differential diagnosis, patient details, and provider details. Any of those notes that you enter from this page will actually carry forward into your assessment and plan details, also into your patient details on the patient plan, and then also into your provider details and your master document. So you can also access any previously built my phrases. You won't have the opportunity to build new my phrases, but you can access any that you've already created for these categories. I'll just add in a few notes. So that we can see where these show up on those generated documents. And for my patient details, I may have my phrase currently built, and it will just paste that in. Moving to the right, I can take today's assessment and I can add it to my problems list, and I'll get a prompt asking if I'm sure I want to do that, so I'll click yes. I can also use this opportunity to add this assessment to my favorites list, and sure, I'll do that. We're not currently using the chronic button, so I'm going to skip over that. In a future update, we'll probably hide that button. We just don't have a use for it here at Country Doctor. The next button, the update button, can be useful. So I've selected anxiety into today's assessment, but maybe after completing some of my documentation, I realized there may be a more appropriate code. I can use this update and find a more detailed code that may be appropriate for this assessment. So it's going to pull in that anxiety, that was my previous code, into my search. I could remove this and search for something completely different, or I can use this list to find a more specific code. So I'll select anxiety and depression. So from there, I'll save. And I'm going to try that one more time because I may not have hit save. So this is a saved assessment. And I'm going to go into that update button. And from here, I'm going to select that more specific code that I'd like to use. And that was anxiety associated with depression. And now you'll see that the ICD code, so my entire assessment has changed to that newly selected code. I am able to keep the same notes, so using that update button would allow me to change to a more specific assessment code, but it would carry forward any notes or documentation I've already made. So from there, that was a good example in that as you make changes in this modification window, you want to always be sure to use the save button before redirecting or attempting to go to another screen. So this save button will save everything in this left-hand modification panel, and it will always pop you back into the ProblemIT search tab. So I'll go back in there again to go over the other buttons. This middle button, if I came into this window and I realized there's nothing I need to do and I don't need to save anything, this is sort of a back button. It will let me leave this screen without saving. So I'll do that, and again, it'll bring me back to the ProblemIT tab. And going back in, this red X will delete this entire assessment. So if I wanted to totally delete this assessment and any documentation, I would use the red X. It's important to know, once you've opened this modification window for any assessment, if I try to go anywhere else over on the right hand side, I'm going to be prompted to save, cancel any changes before continuing. It won't allow me to leave the screen without saving or using the back button or the delete. So I'm going to save, and it'll bring me back to ProblemIT, and then we'll go into modifying a problem. So from my problem list, I'm just going to select the problem that I'd like to modify. And maybe this isn't the appropriate problem, so maybe there's another one. And again, I'm going to use this back icon. And maybe this is where I want to start. So I'm starting with this low back pain. Excuse me. The first thing I am able to do now in IMO is add my HPI notes. So if this were, for me, the most convenient place to document my HPI comments, I can do that here. I can also access any my phrases I've previously built in this category. Onset date will pull forward the onset date of the problem. Last addressed would identify the last time this problem was addressed in an encounter. Problem status is where I would update the problem status. Side if appropriate. And resolve. So if I added a resolve date here, this problem would resolve from the problem list. This resolve date functions in the same way it would if I used the resolve button here to the right. Resolve to past medical history, PMH, would resolve the problem, but it would still appear in your histories tab under the past medical history. And here's my notes field. So this is where I would add or update the patient's problem note. As a practice, we've decided we'd like only one current note for each problem. So I will try to find a patient that already has multiple notes and show how you can edit. But essentially, you would have the option of adding in a new note here. You would use the save icon to save your note. If this patient already had multiple notes, I can select any note regardless of the author and edit the most recent note so that my note becomes the most recent and there isn't, a list building. I can also delete duplicates, so while having this note selected, I can use the red X. I'll be prompted, click yes, and then delete the note. Because this problem doesn't have any prior notes, I'm not seeing a list here, but ordinarily if the patient did have multiple notes, I would see all the notes in this field. I would have the option of default or filtering by my own notes if that were appropriate, but again, we as a practice have decided to only add one note per problem. To the right of the notes field, you'll see that I'm currently defaulting to see the problem notes. I can also switch to problem history, and what this would bring up, if this patient had a history of encounters that address this problem, I would have a list of those encounters. And I will pull up a problem that maybe has a bit more history. Moving up to the top, so I'm going to default that back to my problem note. Moving up to the top, I can add this new problem or older problem to today's assessments by clicking to assessments. And what it's reminding me is that any HPI notes that I've entered will move along with this assessment. And there are times when I select the move to assessment that it would have the level of detail already necessary. But if necessary, you may be prompted to add additional details in order to pull in the appropriate assessment code. And there we go. So now it brings me back to that modified note, or the modification page for this note. Again, we don't use the chronic button, so I'm going to skip over that. And we also don't track problems, so I'm not going to address these two since they won't be used in our environment. The next button is the update. So again, I can use this update button to find maybe a more appropriate code. So you'll notice my assessment code changed using that update button, but my notes remained. And this is a good example. Now that that additional note added, I can actually, because we only want to keep one note, I can even take this one note that now is just telling me I updated the problem, and I can edit here to be sure my notes carry forward. And I'll use that save. The next option you'll have in your problem list is the ability to merge. So while I have this low back pain assessment open and selected, I can use this merge button, and what it's telling me is from my list here on the right, I can select a problem that I would like to merge into this low back pain of multiple sites. So I'm going to click OK, and for the sake of the training, let's just say this really is the same issue as this low back pain issue. So I'm going to select the assessment I want to merge, and you'll notice the comment came in to my problem node saying that I've merged this duplicate. That duplicate assessment has also disappeared from my problem list. And again, now that I'm building up these multiple nodes, I can simply come over here and delete this notification just telling me that this merged. Or I can add on to this message if for some reason I wanted to keep that history of the merged node. So I can even bring forward my other comments and then delete that second node. I already went over that I could resolve this problem to my past medical history, or I could simply resolve the problem and it won't show on my past medical history grid. I have the same action buttons where I can save all of my modifications in this problem. The back button would take me out of this screen without saving, or I could delete this problem altogether. So I'm going to save here. And now if we go back in, you'll see I carry forward those notes. My HPI nodes will save into that day's assessment, so into today's encounter. The assessment or the HPI note field would then clear out in the problem list so that at the next encounter that this problem is addressed, this would be a blank field to add new information. So I'm going to go back to my assessment tab, and it's reminding me that I opened this modification window without saving. I didn't make any changes, so I'm going to use the return without save. Then go to my assessment tab, and you'll notice that the low back pain assessment pulled in because I promoted it to my assessments tab. So we've added new and modified assessments, we've added new and modified problems, and we've also added an assessment to both our assessments and problem list at the same time. What you'll notice from this tab is if I try to do any modifications, that it will give me that prompt that those changes can only be made either from the assessment tab or the problem tab. So I'll drop down to the bottom, which is the lower panel. You'll notice down here you have some buttons, and what these will take you, what these will do is take you to these specific areas of the patient's chart. So from IMO, if I wanted to access the patient's lab master or diagnostics or referrals, I would simply click on the button here. It is going to close IMO, but it would bring me directly into that screen. You'll notice all of my assessments I've added in IMO will pull forward, and I can complete any orders necessary. So I'm going to go back into IMO. And I'll drop over to the lower right hand corner. This My IMO button is what I would use to view my current favorites, and these are my favorites across IMO regardless of what patient's chart I'm in. I can single click on a current favorite and delete, or view details, which will bring up the IMO details sheet. Or I can just delete. I can also add new if I wanted to take this opportunity to add a few codes at the same time. I can simply find the code I'd like to add, and it would then appear on my favorites list. So I'm going to save and close from there. And those are the changes in IMO. A few things that may be helpful. I can sort this assessment history by either encounter date or I can do an alphabetical search by description. I can also use this intelligent problem list button here below, so I would want to be on the problems tab. So I can deselect, so you will be defaulted to having this show in a more categorized view, but I can also deselect and it would bring forward a grid that for some may be more helpful. And this will be alphabetical by assessment description. So I'll turn that back on. And those are the IMO changes.